I never imagined that after 14 years of pouring my soul into the same clinic, into the same four walls that had become my second home, I'd find myself sitting across from a stranger in an expensive suit, watching him reduce my life's work to a number on a tablet. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, and utterly indifferent as he tapped the screen, explaining how my career, my loyalty, my years of building something meaningful were worth exactly 60% of what they used to be. I sat there frozen, a half smile plastered on my face out of sheer habit. My hands were folded in my lap, but if you looked closer, you'd have seen how tightly I was gripping my own fingers. I could feel the blood pulsing behind my ears as he leaned back in the chair, like this was just another Tuesday morning meeting. Nothing personal. Dr. Langdon, he said, with a practiced smile that didn't even try to reach his eyes. Just business. I'm Jessica Langdon. I'm 41 years old, and for almost half of my life, I've been a veterinarian in Lexington, Kentucky. I've seen puppies take their first breaths in my hands. I've helped families say their final goodbyes through tears and trembling touches. My name was more than a name on a plaque outside the clinic. It was whispered by hundreds of families as Dr. Jessica, the one they trusted when everything felt fragile. And yet, to this man, to this new owner, I was just another line item on a balance sheet. He called it aligning compensation with industry standards. I called it a gut punch. I had built this clinic with my bare hands, long before they ever dreamed of acquiring it. I'd spent nights here, alone with sick animals whose lives depended on me. I'd gone home smelling like antiseptic and fear, with fur stuck to my clothes and exhaustion written across my face. But I'd never regretted it, because this wasn't just a job, it was a calling. When old Dr. Harrington decided to retire and sell the practice, we'd all been nervous. Of course, he had promised us everything would stay the same, that the new owners would respect the culture we'd built, that they understood what made this place special. I'd believed him. I trusted him like family. 3 weeks after the sale, I realized how naive I'd been. As I stood up from that meeting and walked toward the reception desk, my legs felt strangely weightless, as though they belonged to someone else. Valerie, our receptionist of 12 years, looked up from the computer with wide, worried eyes. She already knew. Everyone already knew. "You too," I whispered. She nodded, her face tightening. 30% cut and fewer hours. The sound of clients chatting in the waiting room drifted toward us, a little girl giggling as she petted a rabbit in her lap, an elderly man resting his hand gently on the golden retriever at his side. Families, lives, trust. That's what this place had always been about. And they were tearing it apart one spreadsheet at a time. I walked back through the hallways, my footsteps echoing softly against the linoleum floor. Every corner held a memory. The room where I'd saved Mrs. Peterson's beagle after a car accident. The surgery suite where I'd worked through the night to save a tiny kitten no one believed would make it. The office where Dr. Harrington had told me, with a proud smile, "One day, Jess, this clinic will be yours." He'd been wrong. The next day, over lunch in the cramped break room, I sat across from Thomas, the youngest veterinarian on staff. He had joined us only 6 months earlier, full of energy and hope, but the way he pushed his salad around the container told me he already knew what corporate ownership felt like. "It always starts the same," he said, "not even looking up, cost-cutting, efficiency improvements. Then they start pushing us to upsell things people don't need. And after that, it's all about numbers. How many patients you see per hour," he added bitterly. "How much revenue you generate. How much you can squeeze out of people who love their pets." His words sliced through me because I knew they were true. I had heard stories from colleagues in other towns, but I'd always told myself, that won't happen here. Not to us. But it was happening, right in front of me. That afternoon, between appointments, I called Dr. Harrington. I hadn't spoken to him much since the sale. I could hear the sound of lake water in the background, the retirement he'd earned after decades of work. I had no idea. "Jessica," he said, his voice thick with guilt. They promised me they'd respect the clinic's values. I would never have sold if I'd known. It's not your fault, I said softly. You deserve to rest. But something in me was changing. The helplessness I'd felt at that conference table was hardening into resolve. I was tired of watching good people be treated like they were disposable. I was tired of pretending loyalty meant anything to people who saw life in dollar signs. I was tired of being told it's just business as if that made betrayal easier to swallow. That night, I sat in my small apartment with a cup of tea that went cold on the table. I looked around at the walls covered in thank you cards from clients, children's drawings of their dogs and cats, photos of animals I'd saved. These weren't transactions, these were lives, and I'd been a part of them. And then a thought surfaced in my mind, small at first, fragile, almost ridiculous. What if I left? But not just left. What if I built something new? I didn't say it out loud. I didn't dare to. But I felt it like a seed planting itself in the soil of my chest. Friday came too quickly. I walked into Brian Hayes's office, his sterile, cold office that smelled like money and nothing else. He didn't even look up at first. When he finally did, his smile was the same polished, empty, rehearsed. Have you made your decision? He asked. I handed him the envelope. This is my 2 weeks' notice, I said. His smile faltered, just for a second, and that second was everything. You're quitting over a standard market adjustment? He asked, as if I should be grateful he'd cut my pay so fairly. I'm pursuing a new opportunity, I said, steady and calm, though my heart was pounding. He leaned back in his chair, studying me like a chess player considering his next move. I didn't expect this from you, he said finally. You're a senior veterinarian. This is how acquisitions work. Everyone adjusts. I almost laughed. Adjust. That's what they called it when they gutted a place from the inside. As I walked out of that office, Valerie caught my arm, her eyes wide. Is it true? She whispered. It's true, I said. She squeezed my hand. Good for you. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, a legal pad in front of me, scribbling numbers and plans. I wasn't sure I had the courage to follow through on commercial lease options, equipment costs, licensing timelines. My tea went cold again, but my determination burned hotter than it ever had. Then my phone buzzed. Whatever you're planning, count me in. It was Maggie, our head technician. I stared at the message for a long time, my throat tightening. Maybe this wasn't a foolish dream after all. The next few days passed in a strange haze. The clinic felt different, colder. Brian hovered around appointments with a clipboard, measuring efficiency. Clients I'd known for years started asking quiet questions during checkups. Where are you going? Doctor, Jessica. When you leave, who'll take care of us? Will you tell us where you're opening? I couldn't say anything yet, but I didn't need to. They already knew. And that's when it really hit me. I wasn't just leaving a clinic. I was walking away from a machine that didn't understand love, loyalty, or trust. But what they didn't understand was that those things are what hold communities together. When the day of my resignation announcement ended, I walked through the parking lot as the late autumn sun bled across the Lexington sky, painting everything in soft gold. I stopped for a moment by my car and stared back at the glowing clinic windows. For 14 years, I'd walked in and out of those doors with a sense of belonging, as if the building itself breathed with me. That night, for the first time, I saw it for what it had become, a cage dressed up as a sanctuary. That weekend, I immersed myself in research. I stayed up long after midnight at my kitchen table, cross-checking zoning laws, calling banks for small business loan requirements, comparing equipment suppliers I'd built relationships with over the years. Each conversation brought me closer to something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, steady current of power returning to my hands. When I called Dr. Harrington again that Sunday evening, I didn't dance around the thought anymore. I'm thinking about opening my own clinic, I told him. Just saying the words made my pulse quicken. For a moment, The only sound was the gentle lapping of lake water in the background. Then his voice came through, warm and steady. Jessica, you should. You have the heart, the skill, and more than enough people who trust you. You've built a community, not just a client list. That's something they can't take away from you. I didn't realize until then how much I needed to hear that. The following Monday, the air inside the clinic felt different, not for everyone, but for me. Every interaction, every appointment, every turn down the hallway carried a quiet finality. Maggie brushed past me with her clipboard that morning and whispered, "I'm with you. Whatever you decide, I'm in." Thomas caught me in the treatment room later that day and said, almost too casually, "If you ever need another vet, give me a call." He smiled in a way that told me he already knew where this was going. Word was spreading, even if I hadn't said a thing. Then something happened that changed everything. Mrs. Davidson, one of my longest, most loyal clients, was waiting for me in the parking lot after her appointment. Her terrier, Oliver, had been my patient since the day she brought him home as a rescue. She stood there with her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, worry etched on her face. "Is it true?" she asked as soon as I stepped outside. Her voice was soft but urgent. I hesitated. I hadn't made anything public yet, but she looked at me the way people do when they already know the answer. "Yes," I finally said, "I'm leaving." She exhaled, almost with relief. "Wherever you go," she said, her hand tightening around Oliver's leash. "Oliver and I will follow you." Something inside me cracked open in that moment. The part of me that still doubted whether I was making a terrible mistake began to disappear. I wasn't alone. I had never really been alone. The next 2 weeks crawled and raced at the same time. I showed up every day and did my work with quiet precision, but under the surface. Every hour felt like a countdown. Brian Hayes, with his polished suit and corporate confidence, began hovering more than usual. He lingered in doorways, timing appointments, making notes, calling out efficiency opportunities like a man dissecting something he didn't understand. He didn't understand that this clinic had never been about numbers. It was about trust, about love, about community. And that's exactly why he'd never truly own it. I kept my plans quiet. But the undercurrent was everywhere. Clients whispered at the front desk, technicians exchanged knowing glances, and Valerie started handing me folded notes with lists of clients who'd called asking for me by name. "These people called today asking where you're going." Each name on those lists felt like another brick in the foundation I was quietly building. One night, unable to sleep, I sat at my laptop and opened a blank document. I wrote out a name at the top of the page: Riverbank Animal Hospital. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. I spent the next hours laying out everything: equipment, staff, financing, location scouting. It felt terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I didn't have corporate backing, a fancy boardroom, or a suit like Brian's, but I had something far more powerful: people's trust. And I was finally starting to realize the weight of that. A week later, after signing my resignation letter, I met with a leasing agent for a small, vacant medical office 7 minutes across town. It used to belong to a pediatrician, which meant most of the infrastructure was already in place. As soon as I walked through those empty rooms, something in me settled. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and quiet beginnings. I could see it: the exam tables, the cozy lobby, Maggie greeting clients, Thomas laughing with a patient's family. I could see it. 2 days later, I signed the lease. I didn't tell Brian. I didn't need to. He would find out soon enough. That week at the clinic felt like standing on the edge of a storm no one else could see. Brian kept walking around with that clipboard like a soldier preparing for battle. Meanwhile, I was quietly planting the seeds of my escape. Then, out of nowhere, something I hadn't expected happened. He called me into his office on a Wednesday afternoon. His tone was different, less smug, more clipped. He leaned forward over the desk. "We're prepared to reconsider your compensation package," he said. For a moment, the old Jessica, the one who always put the clinic before herself, almost faltered. But then I thought about Oliver. about Mrs. Peterson and her beagle, about the dozens of families who'd trusted me for years, about the way the clinic felt colder now, about the list of clients Valerie kept slipping to me like quiet love letters from the community. I looked him straight in the eye. "My decision's already made," I said. He blinked, just once, and that was enough. When I walked out of that office, the air felt sharper, cleaner, like a storm cloud had shifted just slightly out of the way. Valerie intercepted me near the reception desk with another folded note. 20 calls today, she whispered, and if you need a receptionist, you know where to find me. I pressed the note against my chest after she walked away. These weren't just patients. They were people who believed in me, even before I had built anything to believe in. That night, I sat at a corner table in a quiet coffee shop with Thomas and Maggie. The autumn rain tapped softly against the window. I finally told them everything about the lease, about Riverbank, about my vision. Maggie's eyes sparkled, and Thomas leaned forward like he'd been waiting for this moment. "You're going to make it work," Maggie said simply. "And we're going to help." For the first time in weeks. I laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh I'd forced at work. A real laugh. The kind that comes from the gut. The kind that sounds like hope. It was happening, quietly, steadily, dangerously it was happening. But I didn't yet know just how ruthless corporate ownership could be. I didn't know how far they'd go to hold on to something they didn't even understand. And soon, they'd make a move that would change everything. 2 days before my final shift, a new fee schedule appeared on the break room bulletin board. Bold. Black letters announced effective immediately. Prices across the board were raised by 30%. Vaccinations that once cost $45 were now $65. Dental cleanings jumped to $425. And worse, they'd added premium care packages filled with unnecessary tests and extras for healthy pets. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," whispered Jenna, one of the newer vets, her eyes wide with disgust. When Mrs. Whitaker brought in her elderly cat for an arthritis check that afternoon, I faced a moment I'll never forget. Corporate protocol demanded I push for a $500 wellness panel we'd literally just run 2 months earlier. She lived on a fixed income. Her hands shook as she held the carrier, her voice soft and worried. "Do we really need to do this again so soon?" she asked. I took a slow breath. I'd always sworn to myself I would never betray a client's trust for a profit margin. "In my professional opinion," I said gently, "no, we can wait." Her relief was immediate. I could see it in the way her shoulders softened. But then Brian appeared. He must have been monitoring the appointment through the new efficiency system. He walked in like a salesman who smelled blood in the water. Charming smile ready. In minutes. He turned that quiet relief into confusion, guilt, and finally reluctant agreement. Mrs. Whitaker signed the papers. Her hands trembled the whole time. As soon as she left, he pulled me aside. "When we recommend a protocol," he said sharply, "we expect our veterinarians to support it fully." "Those tests were unnecessary," I snapped. "This isn't medicine anymore, this is exploitation." "This is standardized care," he countered. "Your emotional attachment is clouding your judgment." For a second, I almost laughed. Emotional attachment. That's what they called caring about people. He checked his watch dismissively. "Thankfully, we'll only have to manage your approach for one more day." I stood there in that sterile hallway, my heart pounding, and realized I was done being polite. I wasn't going to let them turn love into numbers. I wasn't going to let them own the people who trusted me. I wasn't going to let them break what we'd built. And if they thought my departure was going to be quiet, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of rain against my bedroom window. The clinic I'd once loved had become a battlefield, not of medicine, but of power. I turned over and stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day in brutal clarity. The way Brian had stood there in the exam room like a salesman, not a manager. The way Mrs. Whitaker's hands trembled as she reached for her wallet. The way I felt my chest tighten as I realized this was no longer about healing. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, A decision crystallized in me like ice. I'd been planning to leave quietly. I'd told myself it was wiser that way, less risk, fewer complications, more control. But Brightpaw's corporate tactics had made one thing painfully clear: they weren't going to let me leave quietly. They were going to squeeze every last bit of trust, every last dollar, from the people I loved serving, and they were going to erase me from the clinic before I even walked out the door. Around 2 a.m., I sat at my laptop and typed a message to my lawyer. Need to accelerate timeline. How soon can we open in limited capacity? Her reply came 15 minutes later, as if she'd been awake, expecting this. With temporary equipment rentals and expedited permits, maybe 2 weeks, call me in the morning. I stared at that message for a long time, my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. 2 weeks. I could do this. No, I would do this. The next morning, I walked into Oakwood Animal Clinic with a strange calm. It wasn't peace exactly, more like the sharp stillness of a storm gathering on the horizon. It was my final day. Valerie greeted me with a soft, knowing smile from behind the reception desk. Schedule looks light, she murmured. Yeah, I said, scanning the chart, barely 4 appointments. Brian had blocked off most of my day for transition paperwork. Translation, they'd already reassigned my patients. It felt like watching someone dismantle your home brick by brick while you stood there helpless. But I wasn't helpless anymore, not today. Throughout the morning, staff members found quiet ways to say goodbye. Maggie brushed my arm as she passed, whispering, "See you soon." Jenna pressed a small, folded note into my hand. "Thank you," it said, "for not selling out." I fought to keep my composure. I had spent 14 years pouring my heart into this place. Leaving wasn't just walking away from a job, it was ripping up roots. But there comes a point when staying becomes a slow death. And I had reached it. At noon, Brian summoned me to the conference room. I expected a standard exit interview, the HR formalities, the signature lines, maybe a bland, "We wish you well." But when I opened the door, my stomach dropped. 2 strangers were seated at the table, a stern woman in a gray suit and a man with a folder in front of him. "Jessica," Brian greeted me, his voice artificially polite. "Before we process your departure, we need to address some concerns." The woman slid a letter across the table like a weapon. "This is a cease and desist regarding any plans to practice veterinary medicine within a 20-mile radius of this facility for a period of 1 year." I stared at the paper, not touching it. "Not yet. I don't recall signing any non-compete." I said slowly, "It's incorporated into the transition documents all employees signed when Brightpaw acquired the clinic," she said smoothly, like someone who'd done this 100 times before. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own copies of every document I'd signed during the sale transition. I placed them on the table with deliberate calm. "There's no non-compete clause in here." My lawyer confirmed it. The room shifted. Brian's smugness faltered. The woman's face tightened slightly, just enough to tell me she wasn't used to people coming prepared. "And even if there was," I continued, my voice steady, "Kentucky law limits non-compete enforcement for medical professionals, especially when patient welfare is involved." For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us was a taut wire. Then the HR director cleared her throat, adopting a softer tone. "Dr. Langdon, we're not looking for a legal battle. Perhaps we can find a solution that works for everyone." Of course they wanted a compromise. They didn't care about the legalities, they cared about control. But I'd learned something about control over the last 3 weeks. I'd learned how to take it back. 2 hours later, I walked out of that conference room with an agreement in hand. I would not actively solicit Oakwood's clients for 30 days, and in return, Brightpaw would drop any attempt to restrict my location or timeline. They thought they'd bought themselves safety. What they didn't realize was that I didn't need to solicit anyone. People had already made their choice. I packed my belongings slowly, methodically, taking down framed photos, a few keepsakes, and the hand-drawn thank you cards that covered my bulletin board. Each one felt like a small heartbeat in my hands. When I stepped outside with the box in my arms, the air was cold but clean. The clinic looked the same from the outside, but inside me, everything had changed. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Valerie. Just overheard Brian on the phone with corporate. He said, "She's just one veterinarian. How much impact could her leaving possibly have?" I stopped and let the words sink in. A laugh, quiet but sharp, slipped out of me. They had no idea. They had no idea what was coming. 17 days later, Riverbank Animal Hospital opened its doors. We weren't supposed to be ready by any reasonable timeline. It should have taken months. But when you're fueled by purpose and maybe a little fury, impossible timelines start to bend. The night before opening, Maggie and Thomas stayed late helping me unpack equipment. Valerie sat on the floor printing out forms and organizing client folders. The sign above the entrance gleamed softly in the night. Riverbank Animal Hospital. It wasn't just a building. It was a promise to myself that I would never let someone else devalue what I stood for again. We'd only planned for a soft opening, a few appointments, mostly clients whose pets had ongoing medical needs. I'd personally called about 20 families. That was it. But at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before opening, I looked out the front window and froze. A line of people stretched across the parking lot and down the sidewalk. Families holding leashes, children cradling cats, elderly couples with carriers balanced in their arms. Familiar faces I had cared for over the years. People I thought I might never see again. Thomas came up beside me, his coffee halfway to his lips. "Did you call all these people?" I shook my head slowly. "No, just a few." Valerie, already at the front desk, smiled knowingly. Word got around. As we opened the doors, the bell above the entrance chimed softly. Mrs. Peterson was the first to walk in, Baxter trotting proudly at her side. Behind her came the Garcias with their 3 rescue cats, Mr. Johnson with his ancient tortoise, and one by one, faces I'd known for years. The sound of that bell, the sound of their voices, the warmth that filled that tiny lobby, it was the sound of taking back something I thought I'd lost forever. By noon, we had registered over 70 pets. By closing, the number had more than doubled. They weren't choosing a brand, they were choosing trust. They were choosing me. What touched me most wasn't the volume, it was the quiet gestures. A hand reaching across the counter, a box of homemade cookies, a child's crayon drawing of Baxter with Dr. Jessica written in crooked letters. One family brought pizza for the staff, saying, "We wanted to help you start right." As we locked the doors that night, exhausted but euphoric, I leaned against the counter and looked around at my small, imperfect, beautiful clinic. I could still smell fresh paint and cleaning solution, but beneath it all, I could feel something stronger: belonging. That same night, I got a text from an old colleague still working at Oakwood. "Emergency meeting called for tomorrow morning. Apparently the schedule is suddenly empty." I stared at the message and felt something I hadn't in weeks. Not fear, not doubt. Power. The power of taking your life back when someone tries to put a price tag on it. In the days that followed, everything moved fast, too fast. But in the best way. What started as a soft opening became a quiet revolution. By the end of our very first week, Riverbank Animal Hospital was overflowing with wagging tails, purring patients, and familiar faces that lit up the space like it had always been their home. The clinic wasn't fancy. The walls were freshly painted but bare. The furniture was second-hand. Some of the equipment was temporarily rented. The phones rang off the hook. Maggie was sprinting between exam rooms. Thomas was laughing with a golden retriever on the floor. Valerie was answering calls so quickly it sounded like music. And me, I was in the middle of it all, exhausted to my bones, but feeling more alive than I had in years. Clients didn't come because of our sign. They came because they trusted us. I heard what they're doing at Oakwood now, one woman said as I vaccinated her cat, her voice low. "They tried to push this premium care plan on me last week. It was ridiculous. I told them I'd wait until I could see you." Another client, a tall man holding a nervous rescue mutt, said, "They acted like they didn't care about my dog at all. Just numbers, but you remember us." Every appointment came with whispers, small stories of disappointment. guilt, and anger. It wasn't just about price hikes. It was about people feeling invisible, and all I did was see them again. That first week, I'd planned to work 8-hour days. By Wednesday, we were pulling 12-hour shifts. We'd started with minimal staff, but Maggie and Thomas never complained. They stayed late, they smiled through exhaustion. Valerie showed up early with a thermos of coffee and that same quiet, fierce loyalty in her eyes. We were building something that belonged to us, not a corporation. On Thursday night, as I sat in my tiny office surrounded by piles of paperwork, Maggie walked in with 2 mugs of tea. "You look like someone who hasn't blinked in an hour," she said, setting one down in front of me. I laughed softly. "I probably haven't." She leaned against the doorframe. "Do you realize what's happening?" I looked up from the patient charts. "We're getting buried in work." She shook her head with a grin. "We're winning, Jess." Her words hit deeper than I expected. For so long, I had felt like I was fighting a silent war I couldn't win. But this wasn't just survival anymore. This was something bigger. That night, before locking up, I walked through each empty room in the clinic. I ran my hand along the counters, listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerators, and breathed in the scent of fresh disinfectant. I thought about the moment I'd handed Brian my resignation letter, about his dismissive smile, about how he said, "She's just one veterinarian." How much impact could her leaving possibly have? I whispered to the empty room, "More than you ever imagined." The next week, the impact became undeniable. Our appointment book filled faster than we could schedule. New clients, people I'd never met before, began calling, saying they'd heard about us through neighbors or community Facebook groups. Word was spreading, not because of ads or promotions, but because people talked about trust like it was something precious. And it was. Meanwhile, at Oakwood, things weren't going as smoothly. I didn't have to spy to know it. Clients told me everything. Families arrived frustrated, saying they'd waited hours to get appointments or felt pressured into unnecessary procedures. A few even came in crying, angry about how impersonal the place had become. One afternoon, an older man named Robert came in with his elderly shepherd, Luna. He'd been my client for over a decade. He sat down in the exam room and shook his head slowly. They said Luna needed a geriatric wellness package. It cost almost $700. I asked them to explain, and the girl at the desk couldn't even tell me what half the tests were for, so I left. His voice cracked when he added, "You've always told me the truth, Jessica, even when it wasn't easy to hear." I knelt beside Luna, pressing my forehead gently against hers. "That's never going to change," I promised him. Trust. It wasn't something you could buy with fancy logos or sleek marketing campaigns. You earned it slowly, over years of standing beside people when their pets were sick, frightened, or dying. And once you earned it, you didn't lose it overnight. But Brightpaw didn't understand that. About 3 weeks after opening, I received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Harrington, my mentor, the man who had first handed me a set of clinic keys and told me, "This isn't just a job, it's a calling." He stood in the lobby, looking around at the simple but warm space, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I had to see it with my own eyes," he said, voice soft but proud. I hugged him tightly. "Welcome to Riverbank." He walked slowly through each room, nodding, smiling, asking quiet questions. Maggie beamed when I introduced her as our lead technician. Thomas offered a mock salute as he rushed past with a carrier in his arms. Valerie gave him a cookie from the tin a client had dropped off that morning. Dr. Harrington chuckled softly. "This place has heart," he said. "I can feel it." "It's not much yet," I admitted. He turned to me, his expression serious. "It's everything." For a moment, standing there in that hallway, I felt like the young, terrified new graduate I'd been when I first walked into Oakwood years ago. Except this time, I wasn't standing in someone else's dream. I was standing in mine. He hesitated as we reached the door. "Jessica," he said quietly, "I made a mistake selling to them. I should have trusted you." I squeezed his hand. Everything happened the way it needed to. I wouldn't have done this if I hadn't seen what they'd do to us. His eyes softened, and he nodded. Then maybe it was worth it. But Brightpaw wasn't done with me. 2 days after Dr. Harrington's visit, an email landed in my inbox. It was from Brian Hayes, requesting a meeting to discuss the changing veterinary landscape in Lexington. I stared at the message for a long time, a slow smile creeping across my face. There it was, the beginning of the ripple they hadn't expected. I replied with deliberate calm. Tuesday, 2 p.m. works for me. When Tuesday came, Brian arrived at Riverbank's front desk wearing the same expensive suit, the same carefully practiced smile, except this time, he didn't look quite as untouchable. His confidence was dented. He glanced around the lobby at the line of clients, at the warm chatter, at the full appointment board behind the desk. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "Quite the operation you've got here," he said as I led him into my small office. "Just business," I replied softly, echoing his own words from weeks ago. We sat across from each other the same way we had the day he told me I was worth 60% of my salary. Only now, the power didn't sit in his chair. It sat in mine. "I think we can work together," he began, leaning forward. "The market's changing. There's no reason for competition to become hostile." I raised an eyebrow. "Hostile?" He cleared his throat. "Oakwood's client base has shifted dramatically. I think we can come to an arrangement." He meant they were bleeding clients. He meant they underestimated me. And he meant they were scared. I folded my hands on the desk. "You thought one veterinarian wouldn't matter. You were wrong." He flinched just slightly, the kind of reaction someone tries to mask but can't. "This isn't personal," he began. I smiled coldly. "You're right, it's not. It's just business." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask slipped. I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't here to make peace. He was here to find a way to control the damage. But here's the thing about damage once it's done. There's no going back. "You'll figure it out," I said finally, standing to end the meeting. "Lexington has plenty of room for good care. If you want people to stay, maybe start treating them like more than numbers." He walked out without saying another word. I watched through the window as he crossed the parking lot, shoulders a little lower than when he'd walked in. When I returned to the lobby, Maggie was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "How'd the big bad wolf do?" I laughed softly, lost a little fur. Thomas raised a brow. "So, they're feeling it." "Oh, they're feeling it," I said. The truth was, they weren't just losing clients. They were losing something far more valuable: trust. Once that's gone, no amount of marketing can bring it back. Over the next few weeks, we kept growing. Not explosively, not chaotically, just steadily, word by word, family by family, pet by pet. Every wagging tail, every grateful tear, every relieved smile added another thread to something Brightpaw could never replicate. And every night, when the clinic grew quiet and the lights dimmed, I stood alone for a moment in the lobby and breathed it all in the scent of hope, of courage, of taking back what they said I couldn't. It wasn't revenge born of rage, it was something quieter, stronger, more enduring. It was reclaiming myself. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, what began as a fragile hope became something real, something solid. Riverbank Animal Hospital grew from a handful of loyal families to a thriving practice filled with laughter, barks, purrs, and the quiet hum of trust returning home. Every morning when I unlocked the doors, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and disinfectant greeted me like an old friend. Clients no longer looked worried when they walked in, they looked safe. Dogs wagged their tails the moment they stepped through the door, as if they could feel the warmth here. Cats that once trembled in carriers now purred softly in their owner's arms, sensing a space where their pain wasn't being measured in dollars. This wasn't a clinic built on profit margins. It was built on the very thing corporate ownership could never replicate: loyalty born from care. I'll never forget the morning Mrs. Whitaker came back with Chairman Meow. She was holding him like he was made of glass, her eyes filled with the same quiet worry I'd seen so many times before. I wanted to bring him here, she whispered, as if afraid to break something fragile. I placed my hand on her arm and smiled. You're home. When I finished examining him, she exhaled deeply. I can breathe again here, at Oakwood. I felt like they were waiting for me to say yes to a price, not caring what he actually needed. Her words cut deep because I knew they were true. I'd seen that look on her face the day Brian pressured her into signing that overpriced wellness package. I'd seen her shoulders slump under the weight of manufactured guilt, and I'd promised myself that no one under my care would ever feel that way again. I walked her out that morning, the sun warming the sidewalk, Chairman Meow peeking his little head out of the carrier. She smiled at me the way someone does when they found something they thought they'd lost. That smile alone was worth every sleepless night. Word about Riverbank spread far beyond the little community we started with. Families from across Lexington began showing up, some quietly, some angry, some in tears. I don't trust them anymore. A woman told me, holding her aging Labrador close. They don't even look me in the eye when they talk about my dog. Just numbers, packages, promotions. It doesn't feel like care. Again and again, I heard the same thing: they wanted to be treated like people, not walking wallets. Every single story reminded me why I had walked away from everything I'd built at Oakwood to start over with nothing but courage and a lease on a dusty old building. The irony was almost poetic. Brightpaw had spent millions acquiring Oakwood, buying shiny equipment, installing efficiency systems, and hiring regional managers in sharp suits. And yet, they were bleeding clients to a tiny independent clinic with secondhand furniture and an overworked but fiercely loyal team. Not because we were cheaper, but because we were human. One afternoon, as I finished a routine checkup, Maggie popped her head into the exam room. You might want to see this, she said, her grin barely contained. I followed her to the reception area. Standing there, awkwardly, was Brian Hayes. Same tailored suit, same expensive watch, but his shoulders weren't squared anymore. His perfect smile was strained. Jessica, he greeted. Brian, I replied evenly. I led him to my office. The last time he'd sat across from me like this. He was the man with the clipboard, the one with power. Now, everything felt different. The energy had shifted entirely. He looked around the small but bustling clinic, taking in the walls covered with thank you cards, the sounds of families chatting in the lobby, the steady rhythm of a place that had grown without him. I saw it in his eyes, the dawning realization that what he'd dismissed as a minor inconvenience had turned into something much bigger. I won't pretend this is easy, he began. Oakwood has lost a significant portion of its client base. I leaned back in my chair, hands folded calmly. People make their own choices. Brian. His jaw tightened. Just a little. We underestimated how much loyalty was attached to you. I admit that. For a heartbeat. The room was silent except for the faint sound of a dog barking outside. And in that silence, something inside me settled. Not in arrogance, not in gloating, just a quiet, unshakable peace. He cleared his throat. We're restructuring. I wanted to propose some kind of partnership. A laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Not cruel, but raw and honest. You wanted to cut my salary by 40%, Brian. You wanted to erase everything I built. And now, because it didn't work out the way you expected, you want a partner. He tried to soften his tone. It's just business. I met his gaze. No, Brian. This? I gestured to the bustling clinic outside the door, to the handwritten notes on the wall, to the people waiting to see me. This isn't just business. This is trust, and you can't buy it. He said nothing after that. There was nothing left to say. When he finally walked out, I stood at the window and watched him get into his expensive car, shoulders heavy, mask slipping, for the first time since the day he'd looked down at me from across that sleek corporate desk. I realized something important. He wasn't the one holding the power anymore. I was. Months later, our client base had grown to more than 800 families. Valerie joked that we needed to build a second floor. Thomas kept saying we needed to buy a coffee machine that wasn't older than he was. Maggie stuck sticky notes everywhere with silly drawings that made the whole team laugh when we were tired. Every day was chaotic. Every day was long. Every day was worth it. One evening, as the last appointment ended and the sun dipped low behind the trees, I walked through the clinic slowly, just like I had on our very first night. The air was warm and still, filled with the soft scent of disinfectant, coffee, and the faint trace of animal fur. I paused in the lobby and looked at the wall behind the reception desk. It had started with a single thank you card the day we opened. Now, it was covered floor to ceiling with letters, photos, and drawings. Little paw prints. Children scrawled, "Thank you, Dr. Jessica," in rainbow colors. Photos of pets who had healed. A few memorial cards from families who had trusted us in their hardest moments. I ran my hand gently across the wall. These weren't decorations. These were stories. The stories of every person who had chosen to trust me when the world tried to tell them trust was just a transaction. I don't think revenge is always loud. It isn't always about shouting, or destroying, or fighting back with the same cruelty you were shown. Sometimes, revenge is quiet, soft, patient. Sometimes, revenge is simply standing in the place they said you couldn't build, and watching them realize they were wrong. For me, the real revenge wasn't Brightpaw's empty schedule or Brian's forced humility. It was the way families smiled when they walked through my doors. The way they said, "I trust you." It was the way my staff laughed together, tired but proud. It was the way this little clinic felt alive. And maybe, most of all, it was the way I finally felt free. I'd spent years letting someone else define my worth. A corporation, a man with a tablet, a number on a spreadsheet, but in the end, my worth wasn't something they could cut by 40%. It was written in the lives of every animal I'd saved, in the voices of every family who'd followed me, in the quiet strength of every late night I refused to give up. Brian was wrong when he said, "She's just one veterinarian," because I was never just anything. I was someone who built something real, and in the end, that was everything.